Hello, class. This lecture, we're going to talk about the powers granted to the president under the Constitution and how they apply to the coronavirus, or at least a very specific aspect of the coronavirus. All right, let's review. President's powers are set forth in Article 2 of the Constitution. Now, Article 2, there's about, I think, 4 sections in it, and it really doesn't give the president very many powers. All right, we think of the president as being the most powerful person in the country. He's often talked about being maybe one of the most powerful people in the world. But if you go to the Constitution, there's not that many powers that are given to the president. The president's listed as the commander-in-chief of the military. That seems pretty clear. No one argues that. The president can grant pardons. That basically means letting someone out of jail, or at least federal prison, for whatever reason the president wants. He doesn't have to even think the person's innocent or got a bad deal. The president can say, I don't want that person to be in jail, so they go free. President can make treaties. However, this is limited. The president really can only negotiate treaties. The treaty only goes into effect if the Senate, the legislative branch, the Senate confirms the treaty or approves of it. The president receives ambassadors and ministers. This is in the president's role as head of state. So when other countries send representatives, or even if their president or prime minister or king or queen comes to America, it's the president's job to basically receive them, to talk, to meet with them, that sort of thing. Now, the president gets to nominate and appoint several different offices. One, ambassadors. Those are people who represent our country in other countries. So we send an ambassador to just about every country in the world, and that ambassador is supposed to represent America in whatever dealings America has with that particular country. Ministers or consuls are also appointed by the president. These are basically just people who head up various agencies usually. Most importantly, or at least, maybe not most importantly, but most publicly, this is what gets the most attention, the president can appoint judges, particularly Supreme Court judges. And we've seen a lot of controversy of this over the last several years. Now again, the president gets to appoint the judges, but the judges only take office if they are approved by the Senate. All right, so again, the president can't just pick whoever he or she wants to be a judge. And the president can do that, but the Senate has to approve it. All right, so the president has to keep in mind when selecting the judges to pick someone that he or she believes will be approved by the Senate. All right, and finally, the president can appoint various other officers of the United States. Next, president reports to Congress. This is called the State of the Union. Every January, presidents give what's called the State of the Union speech. The tradition has now become the president will travel to Congress, which is only a couple miles away from the White House. The president will go down to Congress and have a meeting and give, quote unquote, the State of the Union. This is basically just where the president discusses what he or she sees as the main issues of the day, and in more recent years, the president usually gives their plan for how they're going to deal with these issues and what they want to accomplish in the upcoming year. 7, the president can convene Congress under certain circumstances. To convene just means to order Congress to meet. So say Congress is off on summer break or holiday break or something like that, and the president thinks there's an important issue they need to deal with, the president can call them back to Washington, D.C. for session. And finally, the president's job is to execute the laws. All right, so 8 things. A lot of these are very narrowly drafted. All right, so the Constitution, when you read it, would not seem like the president has just a tremendous amount of power, although we've seen in recent years that the president certainly does. All right, So let's talk about this law. One of the reasons the president has so much power is because Congress keeps giving it to him. All right, now, Article 1 of the Constitution deals with the legislative branch, and it gives Congress many more types of powers than it gives to the president in Article 2. However, over the years, Congress has taken to the habit of writing laws that simply give the president more powers that may not be explicitly set forth in the Constitution, but Congress writes a law saying the president can do various things. All right. In this past spring, right after the coronavirus hit, President Trump ordered certain private companies to make protective equipment and ventilators. Protective equipment is to help healthcare professionals, stay safe. Ventilators is used to treat the coronavirus. The coronavirus is basically a respiratory or a lung disease in many aspects, and so ventilators help sick people breathe. And so the president told private companies, "Hey, stop making what you usually make, and start making protective equipment and ventilators." Now, the president claims his power under this law written back in 1950 called the Defense Production Act. And this allows presidents to order companies to make materials for, quote, national defense purposes. And arguably, national defense can be defined to include disasters and emergencies. The thinking here is that the coronavirus is so dangerous that it constitutes a disaster and or an emergency in trying to deal with it. So the president said, look, the Defense Production Act allowed me to do this. Now, usually what happens when a president tries to do some action, the opposing political party usually stands and says, whoa, we don't know if the president can do this. This is unconstitutional. This was an odd situation where, as I recall last spring, when the president ordered companies to make protective equipment and ventilators, something that may or may not be constitutional, the opposing party, the Democrats in this case, instead of saying, whoa, wait a minute, are we sure the presidents are allowed to do this? They actually criticize the president for not taking more action, for not taking this action sooner. So this was a very odd circumstance where the president's taking some action that arguably, pushes the limits of presidential authority under the Constitution, but without the opposing party arguing against it. Instead, they argued, well, he should have taken more action. So this is kind of a unique situation. But anyway, there's this Defense Production Act, which allows presidents to order companies to start making materials that will help the nation in times of emergency or national defense issues. A similar issue, albeit in a very different circumstance, but a similar issue came up back during the Korean War. And it led to this case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer. The facts of this case are that President Truman, he was president during the Korean War, and he tried to seize most steel mills to avoid a strike. Okay, a strike is when all the workers in a particular industry or company get upset at their conditions. They don't think they're getting paid enough, they're being made to work too long, or various other issues like that. And they all decide, okay, none of us are going to work until the company meets our demands. Well, here there was a fear that steel workers, people who were producing steel, were going to go on strike. And this worried Truman because America was in the middle of the war in Korea, and the army or the military needed steel to make battleships and tanks and airplanes and bombs and weapons and things like that. So President Truman was afraid that if the steel workers went on strike and quit making steel, America would have problems meeting its capacity to fight the war in Korea. So he basically tried to take over the steel mills to prevent the strike. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that the Constitution did not allow the president to seize steel mills, basically talking about private property. The president can't just go around seizing private property because there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can do that. And, at least in this case, in Youngstown Sheet and Tube, Congress had not given the president permission to do this. Now, despite this ruling, most Supreme Court justices did agree that the president does have some powers that are implied in the Constitution. All right, on the previous slide, we talked about those powers that are explicitly listed, they're specifically listed. And the Supreme Court said, okay, even though, or most justices on the Supreme Court agreed that even though President Truman had gone too far in trying to take over steel mills, presidents do in fact have at least some sort of powers that are merely implied, not explicitly stated, but merely implied by the Constitution. However, they just thought Truman went too far. And he said, look, it's not in the Constitution, and since Congress has never given the president permission to go around seizing private property under such circumstances, it was unconstitutional for President Truman to do so. So, that gets us back to these protective equipment, PPE, and ventilators. Can a president constitutionally order companies to start making PPEs and ventilators? Well, there's certainly nothing in the Constitution that specifically talks about these issues like this. But as we pointed out 2 slides ago, there is this Defense Production Act. So the argument would be, okay, is dealing with a disease really national defense? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It can certainly jeopardize the safety of individuals. And even if it is, what exactly does this law authorize? Because it says you can make materials for national defense purposes, but does that include any and all items that may help a disease, ventilators, PPEs? What about masks? Could a company be ordered to make masks? These are questions that you can ask in this situation. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. One, I want you to think about whether you think the president can constitutionally order this. Now, I want you to think, does anyone really care? Do you care? Okay? If these companies, and presumably they're going to get paid for the things they make, are ordered to make ventilators, and that helps keep people alive during the coronavirus. If these companies make PPEs, and that helps keep doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals safe while treating people with the coronavirus, do you much care whether or not the Constitution gave the president the power to do that if it actually helps people? And this is something we all have to wrestle with. You know, we all agree that, okay, presidents and the government needs to follow the laws, follow the Constitution. But a lot of times when they're doing actions that we agree with, sometimes people don't necessarily care how constitutional that may or may not be. All right, I'm going to bring up a law. A lot of you listening to this video are probably too young to remember this, but after 9/11, all right, the government passed what was known as the Patriot Act. It was a law that gave the government many, many more powers to fight terrorism. And arguably, some of these powers weren't constitutional. All right, remember, the Constitution protects things like people from unreasonable searches and seizures. So, being able to listen to non-suspects' phone calls, legal, or look at their emails. Is that constitutional? I don't know. But I can tell you that when the Patriot Act was passed, and you'll see it was passed 98-1 in the Senate, not many people were worried about these issues. They were too afraid of terrorism to really get into the details of, wait, what does the Constitution allow here? In fact, the Patriot Act is, as I recall, is like 2,000 pages long. It was really long. I can't remember the exact number. I may be exaggerating when I say 2,000, but I may not be. It was really long. But I remember there were people who had voted, politicians who had voted for the bill, who later admitted that they hadn't actually read the whole thing. Right? It was just too long and things were happening too quickly. So this is another example of, when we're faced with a crisis, sometimes, what the Constitution does and doesn't allow uh, may not always be at the top of politicians' minds when they're passing these laws. They're more worried about dealing with the immediate crisis. Um, and so what you have to do is ask yourself, is that okay? Um, was that worth it after 9/11 to pass some laws that the senators hadn't even read in full, so didn't know what they were or were not constitutional? Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But you particularly care. You need to ask yourself, is that something that's important to you? That the government always act within the law and within the constitutional limits, um, even when what they're doing is something you may agree with. Even if they're doing something that, like here, 98 out of 99 senators thought it was a good idea. Do they still need to work within the Constitution? Because ultimately, we who vote on these politicians, we the people who vote on these politicians, are the ones who get to decide this. Right? If we don't think it's constitutional, we can vote them out. We can push for them to, appoint judges who will uphold the Constitution, this sort of thing. So ultimately, this is something you need to decide for yourself when you get old enough to vote. Okay? So I just wanted to throw this up because these are issues that are, we talk about a lot of these constitutional provisions and powers in a vacuum, but I wanted to just bring up some issues that are more topical here in 2020 so you can start thinking about them. All right. So your task now is to think about how you feel about these things. And look, you don't have to decide now. You may change your mind as you get older, as you learn more about government and how it works and that sort of thing. But this is something that you need to start thinking about because one day you may be standing in the voting booth thinking, all right, am I going to vote for this person or not based on how they view these issues?